Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this number 2 lecture on the Lee-Enfield by Ian Frayling. I'll hand over to Ian. Thank you, Ian.
I've entitled the talk From Magazine Lee Metford to L42 and Beyond because people are still doing things with Lee-Enfield actions. And so the story continues. Now, I just need to shrink this little box up at the top, which stops me seeing the screen. Right. Anyway, okay. So back to the point. Not everybody has been aware that the Lee-Enfield Rifle Association that we set up in 1998 actually exists. I happen to be a founder member. I'm number 23 because Paul Quilliam was sitting on my left and the clipboard went round the room in the Army Target Rifle Club at Bisley, and I was number 23. So there you are. I'm by no means an expert and I am still learning. So it is impossible to cover every small detail, even in 2 parts. I've realized that you could have an hour-long lecture on almost every single slide. What I'd like to do is present a structure to help understand the development, a family tree, and I'm a geneticist by training and profession, and I find it most interesting to see how form and function are related, and both change by force of circumstance. Now, part 1, of course, was up to the rifle number 1 Mark 6, and that is already posted on YouTube. Tonight, we're going to do from the number 4 onwards. But before that, I'm just going to go for a quick recap. So the Lee-Enfield is the most publicly accessible firearm in the United Kingdom, if not the whole of what used to be the British Empire and the Commonwealth. Most people probably walk past one every day and they haven't had foggiest. They don't realise it. Everybody knows about Spitfires and Lancasters, but not Lee-Enfields. Charles Darwin provided the first good description of the process of evolution by means of natural selection from what he observed in nature, in biology. But the process of evolution does not apply simply to biology, but to any process in which there is selection of one of a number of variants, and the process is continuous or reproducing or cycling. So you have to have this feedback loop, and the best of anything gets fed back in, and that becomes the next major point. And one of the main drivers, but not by no means the only one, is the weight of a soldier's kit. And here's a postcard from the First World War to say that he loves the life, but not how much he's been encumbered with. Darwin pointed out that evolution is not continuous. If you look at it over a long enough period, it appears to be continuous, but actually it comes in bursts and then slows down. And then there's another burst when there's a major change in another major evolutionary step. So if you blow that up, you see that at each level here, there's a whole sprinkling of forms of which one is favored and goes on to the next major phase in the process. Now, quick one on nomenclature. The apocryphal bow rubber Indian pattern officers insane for the use of tells us that that's how the army used to do things. And hence it's the rifle short, comma, magazine, Lee-Enfield, comma, Mark III star. Numbered equipment started in 1926. So instead of all that lot, it simply became the rifle .303 inch number 1 Mark III star. Arabic numerals came in at the end of World War II, so Mark 7 became Mark 7. NATO nomenclature came on from the early 50s. The point is that with each of those, you need to specify the caliber, but I'm not going to do that for 303s, only for other calibers, for clarity. Now, today people talk of weapon systems. I think of those as being guided missiles and tanks. But of course, the Lee-Enfield was a weapon system. And so it's not just the rifles, it's the ammunition, the charges, the bayonets, the slings, tools, the whole shebang, as they say. a whole load of people's ideas and forms came together in 1888 for the trials rifles, and this led to the rifle magazine Lee-Metford, which initially was simply called the Magazine Rifle Mark I because there was no other, and therefore everybody knew what they were on about. So this is kind of rifle zero. This is point zero in our story. It became, with the first major change quite quickly, from the change from Metford to Enfield rifling, the magazine Lee-Enfield. It then became shortened, so it became a rifle short magazine Lee-Enfield, the SMLE, and the Mark I came in 1902. This is my example, happens to be a Mark I 3-star made by BSA in 1906. It was then underwent a major transition, much of which was internal, to become the Mark III. And this is a Mark III star in 1916 after various manufacturing expediencies were permitted during the First World War. And this is my example, made by Lithgow in 1943 in the next war. There was a major change in ammunition at the time of the introduction of the Mark III, going from Mark VI to Mark VII, where you've got the pointed Spitzer bullet, which is lighter and faster. And it means that the soldier is not lugging quite so much around for a given amount of ammunition. At the same time, just after the First World War, there were a whole miscellany of 2.2 trainers based on Lee-Enfield actions, but it became the trainer that became standardized was the rifle short 2.2 Mark IV star, the number 2 Mark IV star, because numbers came in early 1920s. And this is my example. It is one from Lithgow, nicely marked up on the butt. So after the First World War, there was a demand for a lighter, handier rifle, with all sorts of changes stimulated by combat. And this led ultimately to the SMLE Mark V, the number 1 Mark V. And you can see that there's aperture sights being put in here, and various other changes. But in the end, it was decided that to convert existing rifles, as the intention was not economical. So this wasn't going to go, but the ideas and the changes persisted until they brought in the rifle number 1 Mark VI. And they had an A pattern in 1924, and then a few years later in the B pattern. And there were many changes. And it's very interesting that in Skennett and Richards, the statement is made that in 1928, the intention was to produce this in India because India had a plant for making the number 1, and therefore they could perhaps more readily adapt to changing that as a single entity rather than the number of factories in the UK. It also brought in a new short spike bayonet, which it was determined was perfectly adequate for the job of killing your opponent by sticking them through their uniform. And as a pathologist, I can tell you that's plenty long enough for doing the business. So the 1888 trials, and we can plot out the family tree in this way, that each major change in the evolution is marked with a red number and a dotted line. And so we're up to this point. The Mark VI is about to evolve into the number 4 Mark I, just before the Second World War. Well, British plant and factories were happily still making the SMLE Mark III. So there wasn't a huge incentive to change just yet, although as we've just heard in the HBSA report, a great story about how the BSA factory in Birmingham was turned upside down one night. And that was a major stimulus to, well, we've finally got to get on with it and change along. Here's the timeline plotted out. So that's where the magazine Lee-Metford comes in. That's a whole change in marks of ammunition, so reminiscent of Darwin's theory that evolution is not continuous. There's a burst of activity, and then they settle on one single mark. And Mark VII did for the rest of the life of the Lee-Enfield. So you can see here 2 yellow boxes for periods of conflict, and we've got up to the Mark VI. What about our poor soldier? So I must apologize that the table in the previous lecture is not quite correct. I started checking these weights and dimensions, and they are not always as they say. I think some people are weighing bayonet plus scabbard or just bayonet. And so I've gone and weighed up the bayonet plus the scabbard, reweighed all the rifles, reweighed ammunition, and there isn't so much difference between Mark 7 and 6 from my own examples multiplied up. So you can see here that by the time we've got to the Mark 6, the bayonet is like half the weight. So it's shaved off a good pound or a pound and a half from what his forebear was lugging around in the trenches. Not an awful lot, but it's all worth having. One big tin of bully beef. So we're getting on to the number 4 Mark 1 now. And this came in the form of number 4 Mark 1 trials rifles in the 1930s, where they worked it out and then it sat there waiting to be actioned and manufactured. They have A prefix serials to identify them to armourers because they may have non-standard parts. Many of them were later converted to the number 4 Mark 1 telescoped rifle. We'll be coming on to that naturally. So the number 4 Mark 1, many of the fundamental changes, alterations in the Lee-Enfield rifle are internal or not that visible on the Mark IV. First of all, it uses industry standard screw threads, British Association, BSW, and British Standard Fine, for example, so that any factory in the company could produce screws by the hundreds of thousands if they needed to, and they knew what they were doing, as opposed to the quaint threading used on many of the original Enfield screws, which was fine for Enfield because they did it all before such things were standardized. The number 4 had a slab-sided receiver as opposed to the smooth curves on the SMLE, which made it not only stronger, but also it made it easier to put, for example, a telescope on the side. And also the cocking piece started off round, circular, like SMLEs, and it became flat, easy to machine, just as good for the process. The whole thing was designed for easier, quicker machining using less skilled personnel. The bolt head engages inside the body instead of outside, so the bolt head itself can be much smaller, and there's the bolt catch is in the body, not on the bolt head. So that makes it smaller, easier, etc. Both the bayonet and the proposed grenade launcher attached to a heavier barrel by the same lugs, so that saved weight. There wasn't a great big lump at the front for attaching a huge bayonet. So that also saved weight. And the way that the barrel and the action mate together with the bearing points was fundamentally changed. We will go on to that shortly. And there were subtle changes in the magazines. This is the earliest number 4 Mark 1 that I've come across. And as you can see, it's been converted into a skeleton action for instructional purposes. So it's been completely deactivated. And yet it broke my heart to be told that if I wanted to acquire it, it would have to be deactivated. And I frankly couldn't bear to do that. So I let it be, but I was allowed to take some pictures. And you can see that there's a B for BSA, and it's a 1941, and it's only 4 digits. All other Lee-Enfields, apart from the first batch of BSAs, are 5-digit rifles. So this is a very early one. This must be October, November, December 1940, or 1941. So although the rifle was promulgated in 1939, it was only then that they finally were stimulated to get on with making it. So some changes here from the number 1 Mark III Star, or number Mark III probably, to the number 4 Mark 1. You can see here on the SMLE, you've got a thick charger bridge, deep recess for the thumb, the receiver here is lower than the top of the Knox form. And on the number 4, it's a simpler charger here. And you can just see the dovetailing of the crossbar that goes in. So there's not a large forging that has to go over to be riveted in here. It's a better engineering job, really. You can see the aperture sights there, the higher side of the receiver. There's no rail here for the bolt head. The bolt head fits inside, as opposed to on the SMLE where it's the outside. And the little lug here, which is a remnant of evolution from the necessity for the vertical screw for the cutoff, is still there. They didn't change the forms for doing the forging. That would have meant a lot of work. And interestingly, there it is on the early number 4. That was useful later. We'll see why. Here's the curved side of the receiver on an SMLE and the slab side on a number 4. And you can see that there's considerably more metal along here. And that enables the number 4 to be further adapted later in its evolution. So here's a number 4 Mark 1, and it is my personal example. And it happens to be one of the early ones from BSA. So it's still on 4 digits. It's got a letter now, and appropriate for a naval issue rifle. It's U5717. So it's about the 27,000th rifle out of eventually 4.5 million, which makes it an early one. And the books say, and as they do, that early number 4s went to the commandos and the paratroopers, and undoubtedly they did. But clearly the Navy had some of the early ones, and they demanded of BSA that they have proper walnut furniture, brass fittings, and we want a proper finish. These things are going to see sea service and need to be a ship shape. Now we go on to the barrel bearing points, now that we've got sufficient numbers of evolved models. In the magazine Lee-Enfield, the Knox form is held down hard by the large screw under the front of the trigger guard. It's then firmly held down onto the furniture by the middle band and the top band. In fact, it's bedded pretty much all the way along very well. The SMLE Mark 1 has a lighter barrel, and there's a bearing point, of course, up in the nose cap if you ever take them apart with a spring. And there's another bearing point in here with a spring bearing on the best part of the barrel, they thought at the time, to control the whip when it is fired, especially with a light barrel. And this was okay, but it was something that was commented on that you couldn't get at the adjustment screw under here. So on the Mark III, it was moved back, and you'll find a screw under there, as well as the one up here. So the bearing points are subtly different on a Mark III, but the Knox form is a constant. And then on the number 4, the bearing points are only under here, the Knox form, and right at the end of the furniture, bearing up on the barrel by the books. Well, the manuals say that it should be somewhere between 5 and 10 pounds. That means you can put your thumb on the underneath of the barrel here, push it up, let it go, and it will come back with a clack. And if it doesn't, you need to look at that. My original rifle came, and somebody had thought fit to make it free floating, and it grouped to a dinner plate at 100 yards. So I replaced the small bit of walnut under there to bear up on the barrel, and it now groups very nicely. Thank you, as was intended. Early on in World War II, just as in the First War, production expediencies were allowed to produce the Mark I Star. And this was especially the case with US and Canadian production, because by now factories the other side of the Atlantic were now churning out number 4s in great number. Canadian production started with the Mark I, as did US, but it rapidly turned over to Mark I Star. So the bolt catch was replaced by a simple slot near the breech, And in engineering terms, it's a slicker way of doing it, and it saves you a lot of machining of fiddly little bolt catch back at towards the bolt lugs. There was an altered charger bridge to make it easier to manufacture, the magazine catch pin instead of a screw. There were simplified back sights, which were also applied to Mark 1s, because the UK only ever made Mark 1s, and many other manufacturing expediencies, which you can go away and look up for yourself. It was also that beach furniture was allowed in lieu of walnut, although British production mostly stayed walnut, and I think Savage was all walnut as well. So, but you will find differences because rifles have had parts changed over the years. There were all sorts of different rifling. The basic number 4 had 5-groove rifling, but 2-groove was allowed, and in fact, it seems to group better but wear out quicker. And there was even some 6-groove from Canada. It was whatever people could turn out, and frankly, it probably made no material difference to the average infantryman. So here's a number 4 Mark 1 Star, and it is a Stevens Savage from 1942. And it was a complete barn find, I have to say, when it came into my hands. It was completely scuzzy and messed up, but it is the most original Stevens Savage I've come across, which is why I wanted it. We can see various points on the manufacture here. Here's the cutout in the rail instead of lots of little fiddly bits in here for the bolt catch. So in fact, you only have to push the bolt against the spring. So it's not going to just drop out if it's without some effort. And that then allows the bolt head to be released from the rail and you can withdraw it. It's marked number 4 Mark 1 Star, as you would expect. It's also marked US property because Stevens Savage produced under the Lend-Lease principle. The simple 2-position back sight instead of a complex, expensive 1-minute click Singer type back sight is there. It's also, this one's got a short butt, which is of interest because you could get short and long. And in the First World War, you could get bantam sizes as well. This one's had a hard life. It's got a rust mark here from the armourer, and it was therefore probably considered substandard, which is probably why it ended up being bought out as a 410 shotgun, hence the absence of a magazine here. Now, what's also interesting is that there are dovetailed and doweled repairs on the wood, and there's damage on top of those repairs. Actually, what happened was that Stevens Savage were turning out so many number 4s that when they were machining the wood down for the fore ends or any part of the furniture, there were small defects that came to light. And in peacetime, they would have simply stuck them in the bin. But they set up a special workshop where experienced carpenters, woodworkers, could put in dovetailed and doweled wedged parts that would make a good stock quicker than sticking something in the bin. So this rifle was issued or produced with these repairs, well, making goods actually rather than repairs, and it then suffered some damage on top of it. Just to show you the history, there's the Stevens Savage Square S 1942. Here's one produced at the Long Branch plant in Canada. They made 950,000 number 4s in Long Branch. This is about 1,000 from the end of that production, and it was made in 1950. So we can see here that it's Long Branch 1950, although it was probably assembled slightly after that date. What you can see is the Canadian pattern of back sight made out of pressed metal, which is a bit more sophisticated than the 2-position 300/600 version, C Mark III. So this was one of the features that made this rifle called the Canadian number 4 Mark 1 Star. There's differences. There's a spring here different shape spring out of pressed metal to hold the safety on. The safety is a different shape. So these are all Canadian production expediencies, which made it the C Mark number 4. So on our family tree, we can plot the number 4 Mark 1 star, and we get on then to the sniper rifles. Now in World War I, SMLEs have been fitted with various scopes, but it wasn't quite down to a standard pattern in the way that one would now understand it in World War II. Australia came up with a heavy barreled Mark III and fitted some of those with telescopes, and they used the pattern 1918 scope. The number 4 Mark 1T used the telescope sighting number 32, which originally had been intended for use on the Bren gun, but never was. According to Peter Laidler, the first 1 or 2 examples that they were thinking of putting on a bracket to put on a Bren never were, and they were simply put on a bracket and put on a number 4, one of the trials ones, I expect, and it went from there. Canada produced its own C number 4 Mark 1 star T using a number 32 scope. Well, it was originally a number 32 Mark 4, as they called it, but they rapidly changed it to Canadian number 67. Now, a number 4 Mark 1T, just a quick bit on what went on to produce one of these. Rifles on test firing, if they produced a superior factory group, they were stamped TR on the butt socket. They were sent to Holland and Holland, the factory number 51 in southern Britain, hence their factory stamp for conversion. It was paired with the 3x21 telescope number 32. The scope and rifle were cross-numbered. The pads were put on the side by a collimated machine tool, so that the side of the action has had a shaving, so to make it completely in line with the bore. They didn't just stick a scope on a bracket on the side of the action. The rear sight was modified to Mark 1/1 to take off the battle sight to allow the scope, when it was fitted, you could get the bolt out when the scope was fitted. And on the right-hand side, on the cutoff lug, the rifle was then stamped with a tiny S, although Skeleton considers that this was to indicate it was factory sighted over open sights. Well, yeah, maybe. I don't know. The butt swivel was changed to the Mark 1 star version, the Mark 2 swivel sling, to allow a US leather sting. Then the Enfield examiners at Holland and Hollands would stamp a special T on the side of the action, and then it was sent off to Whedon for issue in the cover, with a cover short rifle in the chest small arms number 15. And here's my personal example. It's actually a BSA 1945 rifle. Oh, sorry, it's actually a BSA 1944 rifle. Oh, there you are. There's a mistake that crept in. It's a 1944 rifle with a 1945 scope. And then it was issued in a 1946 dated chest. So we can see here the TR to indicate telescope rifle. And you will find some rifles which simply have that on that were never set up, or only have the pads, but they were never mated with a scope to be intended to be spares. And you can see the pads put on, screws are staked, these are soldered, the back sight has been modified. There's a target rifle type sling point put on the main screw at the front here, and there's the Enfield examiner's T put into the receiver. There's the scope number stamped on the top of the furniture. Every now, some have been reported underneath the furniture. Who knows why? Somebody thought it was a good idea. There's the battle sight ground off. We look underneath, you can see the sling point, and there's the large sling for the American sling, and there's the S51 of Holland and Holland. Now on the other side of the receiver, we can again see the battle sight ground off. But if I blow this up, There's the little S, half hidden by the furniture. So with the scope on, it's a late production. This is towards the end of production, so it's probably made in the batch produced at the end, after the end of the war, to use up all the parts and make as many as they could. So the lenses are bloomed, what we would call coated nowadays. So it's not an average scope, it's a bloomed one. So the light transmission is superior. It's also passed its waterproofing test. So the screw here for allowing gas in and into the scope has been painted red after it was sealed. And the number of the rifle has been stamped on the scope bracket. Hence, just like the scope's number has been stamped on the rifle. So they go together as a pair. Looking at the top, you can see the waterproofing mark and the blooming mark. And we know it's a Taylor Hobson & Co. scope because of their logo. The serial number puts it very high. There were only 25,500 number 4Ts made and about 7,000 scopes. And TTH & Co. were the only ones with the rounded profile just here on the back of the scope. So we can now see that the Australians had produced telescoped rifles from the Mark III-H, which came about as a result of the target rifle, the shortened MLE, because they discovered that a thick barrel, shorter, shot better, which is an interesting observation. So Lithgow started making these barrels, put them into a Mark III-H for sharpshooters, and some of those were then scoped over here. What is very interesting is that they would do the exact same experiment in the early 1900s with SMLEs in the UK. But this didn't seem to get advertised or promoted, presumably because they were so obsessed with keeping the weight off an SMLE. But they didn't realize, because it was before the First World War, how useful it would be to have a somewhat more accurate rifle. So where are we with the weight? Well, we're talking early 1940s, and we've got a number 4 now, and our infantryman is still lugging around about 13 pounds. So it's a bit lighter than his compatriot in World War I, but not by what you might say a huge amount. And now he's got to lug around a whole load of Bren gun ammunition and mortar bombs for the other people in his section. Of course, things were changing. In the Far East, war had started in the jungle, and here's an Australian giving his mate a hat full of cold water in the New Guinea jungle. You can imagine how hard it is lugging stuff around. When the temperature is way up, you've got malaria and dysentery, and life is not pleasant. So anything they could do to make a lighter rifle would be appreciated. So experiments were put in train to lighten the number 4 to make a number 5. And they started off with the number 4. They called it the number 4 lightened, and it came out at 7 pounds 1 ounce. So that's nearly 2 pounds lighter than number 4. So he could carry another mortar bomb. The barrel was shortened to 18 from 24 inches, and there were multiple weight-saving measures. The Knox form was scooped on the outside. The bolt knot was consistently drilled out, because on some number 4s it is and others it isn't. The trigger guard was narrower. The body behind the locking lugs and around the extractor cutout was machined away to make it lighter. The butt socket, where the butt fits into the receiver, is machined out to save some weight. And some of the stock bolts were drilled through. So not only were they wasted on the outside to make them narrower, they were also drilled out down the length. It needed new rear sights because it had to be calibrated to 800 yards and work to give the markings consistent with a full sight only 1.5 feet in front. Shortened lightened furniture. Because of the light weight, they put a rubber butt pad in to absorb the recoil, and it was slung on the side rather than with a swivel on the underneath of the stock. There was also a new bladed bayonet, because although it seems like a good idea to give everybody a 6-inch nail, on a mounting to stick on your number 4, actually soldiers were demanding that they wanted something with a blade on it for doing all the other things that soldiers do, quite apart from using it as a bayonet. And unfortunately, and sadly, we haven't got time tonight to go into it in depth, but there were problems with some rifles that zeroed, others that didn't. So their zero would move from day to day. I've got some insight into this from the study I've been doing on the accuracy of different Lee-Enfield 303s. But interest was waning because after the war, they were thinking about moving to an automatic rifle with a smaller caliber, the EM2, and interest waned. And so they decided that this problem was inherent in the design, and goodness only knows what the cause was, whether it was over tightening, all sorts of things, and they just gave it up as a bad job. Another attempt to produce a lightweight rifle was the Canadian number 4 lightweight, which had a slightly longer barrel, which is slightly shorter than the 25-inch barrel on number 4. It had a one-piece stock, so there was less steel in the receiver, and that saved a fair amount of weight. And in fact, it came out at only 6 pounds 9 ounces. But for various reasons, that wasn't persisted with either. Anyway, here's the number 5 Mark 1 in my possession. And it's a relatively early one, made at Fazakerley in 1944. And you can see that it's got the shorter barrel, the flash suppressor, because with the unburnt powder, you didn't want to give yourself away in the jungle. There's a different sight, the foresight wings with the foresight on the flash suppressor. There's the new bayonet lug under there. You can start to see, well, you can see the butt here is slimmer. It hinges from the side. There's the rear sling swivel. And if we look in detail, we can see that there's some machining been going on here. There's metal taken away there. And that's the number 4, and there's the number 5. So you can see the metal taken off the rear of the receiver and the slimming down here. And it was thought that this weakened the action so as to affect how the rifle shoots. And perhaps this was part of the problem with zeroing and inaccuracy. The trigger guard is the same profile. It's just about 2/3 the width of a usual one when you look at it from the underneath. Looking from the top, you can see the barrel here, and the finish on the outside of this is rough. Clearly they were churning them out at a rate of knots, and frankly, the outside of the barrel, the finish does not matter in wartime, as long as you have an outside of the barrel. And you can see the different back sight, which is only sighted up to 800 yards for this rifle, because frankly, that's all if you can get more than 100 yards in the jungle, you're doing well. So this is a major step in the evolution of the Lee-Enfield, going from the number 4 to the number 5 because of so many changes in the design. So what were the countries that made the number 1 rifle in the Empire, India and Australia, to do about this? Well, it was put to them that they should start to produce number 6s made as cut down number 1s. And so Lithgow set to produce a shortened and lightened rifle number 1, these rifles here, numbers the second and the third ones down from the top. And as you can see from this original photograph from the Lithgow factory, which is now in the Lithgow Small Arms Factory Museum, they tried these and then didn't adopt to them. It was a good idea, but they couldn't quite work out how on earth to fit the back, what to do with the back sights, and they didn't seem to shoot very well. So they went on to produce a number 1 lightened pattern, Australia, with a aperture back sight, and also with the SMLE type back sight moved right back to the Knox form. And you can see these 2 rifles here have an SMLE type butt, but they also tried them with a number 5 type butt, and we'll go on to see what they did. Here's Kerry Garin of HBSA and one of the members of the Lithgow Small Arms Factory Museum. I had a fantastic time there on a couple of medical sabbaticals when, of a weekend, I would take myself off to Lithgow and just have a great time in that museum. So if you're ever anywhere near it, I would absolutely recommend that you go see. So the shortened and lightened rifle number 1, which is what they called it, it was an attempt to produce a jungle carbine. They tried 2 different lengths of barrel, short and shorter. There was a 2-position aperture rear sight, as well as others, as we'll see, a 1-piece top hand guard. They produced a shortened 10-inch bayonet from the 17-inch Patton 07, and that was later used on the Owen submachine gun, so it wasn't wasted. They only produced a batch of about 100 shortened and lightened number 1s. And here's the drawings from the Lithgow Small Arms Factory Museum. You can see the Mark III star profile and the shortened as far as possible back to the central band. You can see the grooves on the side here for getting a grip when you're completely sodden with sweat. You can see that the butt is slimmed down from side to side quite well here. And although it isn't shown on this one, there's you can see how the internal structure of the butt permits of taking some weight out here, but they haven't done it on these drawings. And some drawings here for producing a rear sight somewhere around here. Now, when I visited Lithgow some years ago now, they had just acquired, because Kerry had seen at a local auction, this farmer's pig gun, as it was described, being sold off. And he recognized it for what it was. It's probably the pre-prototype lightened and shortened rifle number 1. You can it's still got an SMLE type forend, and it's been cut back right as far as the center band. The back sight is where it would have been. So it's the minimal type of conversion. But what they have done, they've stamped the brass disc XL39, March 1943. And this rifle's seen a bit of life. Started off as a 1912 BSA, short Lee-Enfield Mark III. It was issued to the Australian Imperial Force in World War I. It then gets stamped 1943 on top of it with its XL39 experimental serial. But if we look at the butt, if you look carefully, there's not just the rasp marks where they've thinned it down a bit. They've also gone a bit too far and it's cracked through. So you can see the stock bolt through it. So they will probably realize at that point, well, you can thin it a bit, but not too much. So that was a useful experiment. And here is a shortened rifle number 1 in the flesh. It's the 20-inch version. In the Australian War Memorial, I was able to examine various exhibits they've got there. And this is one of those Owen gun type bayonets, or the bayonet that later became issued for the Owen gun, showing how it would go on the end of the shortened and lightened. This is example number 2. And that is in the Lithgow Small Arms Factory Museum. Here's some more examples. See, there's no top wood on this one from Lithgow. There's this back sight fitted behind the charger. And then they've done something with the charger, thinking, well, why have this and that when you could just have that? And you can see the milled grooves to take this kind of aperture in there. But then they've also got this version with a squared off charger with a different sort of aperture and settings for presumably 200 and 400 yards. So the number 6 Mark I Australian pattern, it's as to the number 1 as a number 5 is to a number 4. It's much lighter than an SMLE, but it's a little bit heavier than number 5. There were 196 trials rifles because they produced 4 variants with about 48 of each, because there's 2 different sorts of butts and there's 2 different sorts of rear sights. The barrel shortened as a number 5, and it's been similarly slimmed down, but not exactly as a number 5. The Knox form has been scooped on the barrel, the bolt knob's drilled, there's a narrow trigger guard, but the receiver has not been lightened in the same way as a number 4 because it's already lighter. And to do so, they presumably reckoned would just weaken it. There was no point. The butt socket has been drilled through though, and various other changes, and then the trials bayonets. Now, there was an Indian pattern, number 6 Mark 1 intended, but it seems to be that only an experimental pattern exists in the pattern room. Here's the drawings that Lithgow actually hold, and this is the drawings for the number 6 with a standard butt, and you can see here it's now been decided to get some weight out of it, and also the stock bolt is for drilling through. So this is a version with the ordinary stock, but this has got the aperture sight at the back, whereas this has got the original sight simply moved right back to the Knox form. And presumably must have been a matching pair of drawings for the rubber butt versions. Here's some other drawings of all sorts, and these have come from Cheshunt, the Chief Superintendent Armaments Design, CEAD, and these have been sent out to Lithgow, which has copied them for their production purposes. Here's the drawing of the slimmed down wasted stock bolt, which is actually drilled out, which makes, if you could get some weight off, you could, and if it didn't weaken it, that was all right. Here's a fantastic drawing on a piece of notepad of a length gauge to get the amount that you've turned off the front of the barrel to fit the flash hider. And not just this drawing exists, but the tool itself, which is just great. So they have an example at Lithgow of a number 5 type rear sight produced as an experiment before they started to fit number 4 type rear sights. This is XP116, and you can see it's got the number 5 type butt, and it is slung underneath. Interestingly, it's not slung from the side, but it's got the SMLE type back sight right back by the Knox form, you can see here, and you can see here the grooves in the chamber to save up some weight. Here's a number 6 in the Australian War Memorial, XP201, and they've also got XP134, which has a short butt. So it just shows you that they produced a bit of this and a bit of that because it might be needed in the trials. Here's the rear sight, and it's got a different frame, if you like, on here, because there has to be space under here to get an SMLE type bolt head out. So this is further up than on a number 4, but the other parts are Savage parts. Here's comparing, this is a number 5 type flash eliminator with the bayonet lug set back from being underneath the foresight. It's set back because it has to take a pattern 07 type bayonet. Later production has a Bren foresight leaf on it, and the first examples of these were the other way around, with the return at the rear. So they were obviously experimenting with all sorts of things. Here's another view of the number 4 type rear sight, slightly from underneath. But here on the butt, you can see where they've been experimenting carving wood out of the action out of the butt to save weight. And then this is the example in my own collection, which has the number 4 type rear sight and the rubber butt. And you can see it's slung underneath, unlike a number 5 from the side. And I wonder whether that made a difference to accuracy, because you won't have so much twist on the gun when it fires, and you're going to get more twist because it's a lighter gun. So who knows? Maybe these are all factors in it. But looking at it from the top, you can see here the space to allow the bolt head out, and the new back sight with ranges up to 800 yards. And here's the slimmed down, narrower trigger guard. Here's some documents, courtesy of Terence, of documents in CAED regarding the Australian on the Indian number 6, so the Indian pattern, and CAD were intending for a light pattern rifle to be manufactured in India. And here's a whole load of list of drawings for the office to get on with making new tracings, and now it's called a number 6 Mark 1. And then you find that on the 1st of September 1944, this is issued, and then it's cancelled. And it was approved, then cancelled, then reapproved, then recancelled, all in one day on the 7th of September 1945. And you can almost hear the person in the back row of the squad saying, "Make your mind up." So here's the drawings of the Indian pattern from CAD, and you can see that it's similar but different, isn't it? There's that rear sight, which is a modified charger guide, the bored out butt like a number 5, etc., and the flash eliminator with the bayonet lug underneath the foresight, presumably to take a number 5 bayonet. Here's the example in the pattern room, and what stands out, in fact sticks out, is this quaint back sight. And if you notice, there's a sling swivel on the top of the butt and the side of the fore end. So if you put that sling on and you put it over your shoulder, muzzle down because it's pouring down with rain in the monsoon, you're going to get that right in the back of your back. So it's a bit like getting a mortar bomb fin stuck in you from behind. I can only imagine that that was only kind of experimental and that they would have made a better job of it once the soldiers started complaining. So how's the weight going for our poor chap still holding his SMLE Mark III? Well, the number 5 and the number 6 are down to around 12 pounds once you've added the bayonet and the ammunition, which has shaved a couple of pounds off. So that's 2 more tins of bully beef or a mortar bomb to be added to his load, just so that he's carrying enough. So we've passed this mark for shortened rifles here properly. The shortened lightened SMLE didn't quite make the grade. So as we go, after the end of Second World War, there were various improvements that it was desired to make to the number 4, having decided that the number 5 would not be the Army's rifle going forward. And there's various improvements. The trigger on a number 4, like an SMLE, is mounted on the part of the frame that goes around the magazine underneath, so that if the fore end wood gets wet and starts to warp, it can bend that, moving the trigger in relation to the sear and giving you inconsistent pull off. So it was desired to mount the trigger on the top of the receiver, not the trigger guard, to improve it. And hence you had to alter the fore end so that it's got no wood between the 2 rear parts. So you had to arrange for a transverse screw to fix the fore end at the rear where it abuts the butt socket. There's no fabricated parts, thank you, and only Mark 1 rear sights. And beech was allowed instead of walnut for the furniture as a cost-saving measure. Similarly, wartime rifles were converted under factory thorough repair to the same standard, Mark 1.2 and Mark 1.3. Here's a Mark II in my personal collection, and it's one of the fabled ones from the 50,000 allocated to Ireland but never sent, the so-called Irish contract. And you can see here the screw through the back that shows you it's a number 2, Mark II. So not just a Mark IV, we've now got a Mark II as the next main type on. And we now come on to the 2.2 training rifles. Canada did not have number 2 Mark IVs, so they started making number 7 Mark Is from their number 4 Mark I stars, and they were a solid barrel, single shot, and very much resemble a number 4 naturally. So in Britain, it was intended, they made some 2.2 number 5 trials, and these were built on a number 4 Mark I body by BSA. They were magazine fed, and the trigger was mounted on the body, like with a number 4 Mark II. Well, that sort of happened, and then all three UK services went their own way just after the end of the Second World War. So the RAF couldn't wait for the army to make up its mind, so it ordered a batch of number 7s. And these have a little commercial 5-round magazine that inserts into an SMLE type magazine with a nifty bit of spot welding, so that it becomes a magazine fed number 4 trainer. Most of them have got solid barrels, and it's different from the Canadian because it also has an auxiliary extractor and a special ejector. And this is from my own collection too. I went into Mo Parker's in the 90s, and she was advertising number 7s. And I said, do you have one? And she said, I've got 3. Pick the one you like. So I picked this one. And you can see here that the bolt is different. There's the magazine catches back here, not up there. You can see the auxiliary extractor there. And you can see the ejector that is fitted into the side of the receiver, and the 303 ejector screw is not present. It's just been taken out. And on the top, you can see the bolt catch there, and the breech set back slightly into the action. And it's got the commercial windage adjuster that you can fit to a number 4 type rear sight, which I obtained at the same time as the rifle. Here's the number 8 when the army finally got its act together and decided what it wanted. It wanted something superior and good for target use and competition use by the army. So it's a single shot, there's no magazine. It resembles a number 4 in its handling and size and shape. It's got a new taper bored thick barrel. It's a completely different design internally. It's also built on a number 5 body, not a number 4, but it has a different bolt with adjustable trigger, a scissors type sear. So there's no net force in the vertical plane. So it works like this instead of like that. And therefore it is a far superior trigger, and it's fitted up here, my example, with a target type rear sight. It later became the rifle aiming 22 L2A1 used with the 120mm BAT gun, battalion anti-tank gun, the L6 Wombat or the L7 Combat. Just as number 2 Mark IV Stars had a bracket to fit them on the side of the boys' 0.55-inch anti-tank rifle. Here's a number 8 from the top. You can see the barrel is way back here. There's a slab type in the receiver because there's no magazine. And just down here is a little lug that throws the case out that way. You can see the plug put in lieu of a magazine and a place to keep your foresight elements. Although it wasn't issued with those, that was for fitting afterwards. The Navy, finally in 1956, decided they wanted some number 422 type trainers, but they didn't want number 8s. They wanted something that properly resembled a number 4. So they ordered from Parker Hale rifles mostly converted from number 4 Mark IIs, except that mine is converted from a number 4 Mark I. So there you are. It has an offset firing pin like a number 2. It has a relined barrel. So it was the cheapest and simplest conversion. And it's not a number 9, it's an N9 because it is a naval store. Those who know, of course, know that the rifle number 9 was what was called the EM2, which is another story. And here we see Naval .9, Parker Hale 57. There are some commercial made ones made afterwards which have number 9. You can see the 25-yard graduation on the backside. So there's all these 22 trainers that have come out of here, but the number 8 is so much different. It deserves a separate major step in the evolution. We get on now to the 7.62 era. So we were going to have a 280 7mm number 9 Mark I, the EM2, as I mentioned. That was scuppered by NATO standardization on 7.62 by 51. Churchill said we ought to do what the US say. And by this stage, the L1A1 SLR is in trials and it's adopted in 1954. So really, 303s and anything else are going into the reserve, but it was decided to convert 303 number 4s to 762, and L8A1s were made from Mark 2s, L8A4s were made from Mark 1s, etc. Australia also tried to make 762 number 6s, and there's an example in the Australian War Museum. But it was found that receivers cracked because the steel in an SMLE receiver is not the same as a number 4, and there isn't as much of it. So that was given up as a bad job. In the 60s, the factory in India, now of course India was independent after the end of the Second World War, they newly manufactured number 1 type rifles with a modified action made of stronger, more modern steel, and with the appropriate modifications, then they produced the 2A and the 2A1, which has a new back-sight designed for 762 ammunition. Britain in the 1970s wanted a single-shot target rifle shooting 762 based on a number 4 Mark II. So it had an empty number 1 type magazine with a long hammered 762 barrel, and commercial and police versions were produced by Enfield to cover that side of the market. The venerable number 4T was also converted in the 1970s to the L42A1 by putting on the thick and longer 762 barrel. It free floats in the fore end, which has been cut right down. The scope has been redesignated to convert it to metric as used for the 762 ammunition. It has a new bolt head and extractor to take 762 ammunition, and a different magazine here to take 762. And the complete equipment schedule included a mount to take the Generation 1 night sight. So in detail, you can see the drum here recalibrated for metric. The old markings on the number 32 Mark III have been crossed out, and it's become a telescope straight sighting L1A1. So the 762 has taken us out here, and there's this failed experiment of the 762 number 6 trials rifles down there. So in terms of the timeline, we've come from a magazine Lee Metford, sundry marks of ammunition which stabilized here in the First World War. And while Mark 8Z was produced ostensibly for use in medium machine guns, there is at least one record of a sniper in Normandy getting hold of the stuff because, in quotes, it shot a lot better, and he was able to take out a high-ranking German officer at some range and then suffer the consequences by being shelled for most of the rest of the day. Anyway, we can see here that there's this burst of evolution coincident with the Second World War, and we've got all the various marks of 2-2 trainer here, and then the 762 era playing out into the 1970s. So what about our infantryman now? He's early Cold War era, and he's been issued with his number 4 Mark II, with his number 7, with his Mark 7 bayonet, and he's lugging around nearly 14 pounds, which is almost exactly what his forebears, perhaps his father or grandfather, were lugging around in the trenches on the Western Front. So he's not looking exactly best pleased. So what about the weights? So I thought I'd plot it out, and there's this admirable effort to shave a decent amount of weight off, but then it bounces back and even rebounds in the number 4 Mark II. If you add on the bayonet, it's not quite as bad because the numbers getting the spike bayonet, but then they go back to a bladed bayonet and it cancels out most of the difference. And when you add everything up together, you're lugging around the best part of an old stone, and it must have felt like it. And there's the wear weight of the rifle in comparison. So in terms of other things, miscellany and beyond, I'm not going to go over skeleton actions except to mention it already. The 7.62 drill purpose instructional rifle is the L59. There's all sorts of other things. We could have a whole lecture on Delisle carbines, I'm sure, from somebody who might have one. Lithgow has produced post-World War II commercial versions. There are other versions produced by sundry other commercial companies. So the Lee-Enfield keeps on and is still useful. If you are interested, then the chargers go from the Mark I in 1903, the Mark II, and there's two types, the Mark III, the Mark IV, and then the Mark IV Arabic. And there's over 80 makers. And where did the gold ones come from? Well, they come from Mr. Lawrence's shop, which is next to Central Station in Sydney, New South Wales. And they show up and they're quite different from everyone else's, so you won't lose them. Bayonets, everything from the pattern 1888, the 07, the number 4 spike bayonets, the number 5, the number 6, and I've got a 10-inch version of that. The number 7 with the rotating handle, the number 9, and then the number 9 made in South Africa using the blade from an Uzi submachine gun. So we get on to how successful was the Lee-Enfield in terms of numbers? Well, many were conversions or back conversions or repurposings, like the number 2, which was made from SMLEs. So do you count them as an example, or do you just simply count the number of receivers made? Actually, it's easier if you just add them all up. And I think that classes as a second rifle made from an old one. So we'll add them all up. So 7 million SMLEs and that sort, 1.4 million of the early rifles, the so-called long rifles, simply because they brought in a short one. The number 4 series, 4.6 million, jungle carbines, about 250,000, and the later trainers, 42,000 odd. So you get to a figure of well over 13 million rifles made by 3 home factories, 3 factories in the Empire, and a factory in an ex-colony, the United States, who came to our aid in World War II, of course. This has to be the rarest SMLE, I think, because it's the only one known. It's one of the first proof examples that proved the Pratt & Whitney machine tools that Australia had ordered, and then as a pre-production sample. It's the only one known, and they made about half a dozen. So just conclusions then. Over 75 years, the Lee-Enfield rifle became handier because it was shorter with a shorter bayonet. It was lighter to some extent, but then they went back on the deal a bit. It was easier and cheaper to produce, so quicker to produce as well. And economy, industrial economy is what wins wars. I mean, yes, of course, people risking their lives in the front line win wars, but it's actually in the end by force of economies. And combat utility and conflict were definitely a driver because they demanded the handier, lighter, and easier, cheaper to produce. Cost is absolutely an issue, but it isn't simply to save materials. It did occur to me that where it says in a book that they produced Mazak metal butt pads on number 4s instead of gunmetal, also known as brass, that was to save materials. Well, it would have saved a bit, but an RAF Typhoon disgorging 1,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition, each case weighs as much as one butt plate on a number 4. So it's not a question of saving materials. If the factories were held to a constant price, if they could make the rifle cheaper by using cheaper parts, then they're saving. So I think that was the driver in that instance. What about what is the most evolved model or models? Depends on your purpose. If you're talking service or combat, so rifles that actually saw use in the front line, it's probably the number 5 and the L42. But if you're talking training or target, the number 8. But I think the L39 comes a close second if we just look at it. So the number 8 down here has gone through the most major evolutionary steps, although the L8 and the L39 are out here with the most. The L42, Yeah, potentially. But it is simply a conversion of an earlier model without any huge changes except the caliber and the barrel. So many arguments can be made as to what is the most evolved. Acknowledgements. There are almost too many people and organisations to acknowledge, but first of all, I'd like to thank Christopher Rhodes, who is with us tonight, for getting me into the whole subject of historical firearms and an interest in them. And I'd like to thank Terence Hanlon Smith of rifleman.org.uk fame and Ian Patrick for his work in delving into CEAD. And perhaps in the future, we might be able to produce some articles or other lectures going into more detail on things I've touched on tonight. In terms of bibliography, there are all these to seek out and find and get to read. They're all thoroughly good. And it really couldn't have been done, this talk, without the help of Lithgow, the AWM, the Imperial War Museum, of which I'm a member, and also the Historic Arms Resource Centre Miniature Caliber Rifles Research Site, which is rifleman.org, of course. And the final bombshell, of course, like at the end of the first one, is that actually the study of metrology, that it's actually not a 303, it's a 30288. So part two, I promised you all of this, and I haven't got round to the 303 accuracy testing experiments. I have to say they're fascinating. So perhaps if you'll permit me, we can do part three, the follow-up, and I can show you the results of testing 9 different 303s with 12 different sites using 6 different sorts of ammunition, which is illuminating, to say the least. And I shall leave it there.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ian.